Thank you very much, Professor Grimm. Thank you, Professor Riepan, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very, very happy to be here. I've got some slides, so maybe it will be a helpful illustration. They're already coming up. Thank you. So indeed, as Professor Riepan correctly said at the beginning, we're in a very, very precarious moment and a very problematical moment. How do we understand that? And it seems to me that there are really different narratives, and I think all of them will come across in some way or other over the next 2 days. One is that we're in the middle of an amazing technical transformation with technology advancing at a faster rate, I think, than has ever been witnessed in human history. So the pace of technical innovation is just colossal. Secondly, we're in a moment where it looks as if there's a geopolitical fragmentation. Some people talk about bloc formation. Kristalina Georgieva often thinks about the blocks of the 1930s being repeated. In the Financial Times this week, Martin Wolf wrote a really terrifying column about how the world is being dominated by two predatory superpowers, United States and China, and that other countries are going to have to find themselves in a vassal position. I think many of you will have been terrified by that article, but I don't think it's right. So I want to give a more optimistic perspective. We've got surges of inflation in many countries, not all countries, and we've got big asset booms. So how does this all fit together? And we're inclined, I think, to say that this is very unique, but often it seems to me that we're actually echoing something that took place in the past, and that some moments, some dynamics that we saw in previous history are reasserting themselves. And in particular, the story about markets versus states that is everywhere. Do we need a different state policy? Is industrial policy appropriate? Can markets do this? Are the new technologies compatible with traditional markets and traditional ideas about competition? Those are all really, really pressing issues. So I wanted briefly to go back to Joseph Schumpeter and to a small booklet he wrote in 1919 called State Imperialism and Capitalism. And in that book, Schumpeter reflected, it's obviously immediately after the First World War and the first of the big geopolitical upheavals of the 20th century. So Schumpeter was wondering where this came from, and he was wondering in particular whether this comes from capitalistic competition, as many people at the time were suggesting, or whether it comes from some atavistic impulse that is deep in the human psyche or deep in the social structures that antedates modern industrial capitalism. And so the conclusion of that was really quite simple, that it's nationalism and militarism that were destroying the basis for a coordinated, cooperative world. And in particular, he has two phrases that the book was originally written in German, but two phrases are in the book in English, taken from Joseph Chamberlain, the great politician of the British late 19th century and early 20th century, the politician who tried to address the idea of British decline. Britain was declining relatively in the late 19th century. It was overshadowed by the industrial rise of Germany, by the rise of the United States. And Chamberlain's message was twofold. And this is what Schumpeter quotes: learn to think imperially, and tariff reform means work for all. And if you read that, you will see that Chamberlain, who was really a very, very powerful, charismatic orator, was essentially sketching out the kind of position that has made Donald Trump president of the United States on two occasions. Learn to think imperially, and tariff reform, imposing tariffs, Britain was a great free trading country, means work for all. So in this circumstance, is that a story of a breakdown of globalization? Back in 2001, I reflected on the possibility of an end of globalization and a repetition of the Great Depression. I thought that wasn't likely to happen, but it could happen under some conditions, and in particular, in the aftermath of big financial turbulence, big financial crises, that tends to destroy globalization. That's what happened in the interwar period. And then I came back to that theme more recently in a book that looked at the turning points in the history of globalization, 7 crashes. Briefly, a kind of potted history of globalization in 2 sentences. There are 2 big surges of globalization over the industrial era. May have been globalization before that, but this in the modern world, in the industrial era, 2 surges, one in the middle of the 19th century and the other after the 1970s. And one big breakdown of globalization, just measured here by trade relative to world output. There are complexities about whether that really is the right way of calculating this. But you see the impact of the First World War and then the renewed impact of the Great Depression. And you also see that the aftermath of 2008, of a big financial crisis, was not exactly an end of globalization, but a slowbalization. And from the middle of the 2010s, for the first time, world trade was growing at a slower pace than world output, and so world trade relative to world output sinks. So this is before Donald Trump or before Brexit. And what I wanted to do, and I think it's a useful exercise in terms of uncovering the dynamics of the period, the moment that we're living in just now. What I wanted to do was to try to establish what the drivers are of these turning points. And in particular, it seemed to me that a quite simple categorization would be helpful, that you can distinguish supply shocks from demand shocks. Negative supply shocks and negative demand shocks are both at the turning points of globalization, but negative supply shocks in the middle of the 19th century, with widespread hunger in Europe, the best known, I think, is the Irish potato famine, but this was a harvest failure all across Northern Europe. This drove the world policymakers to look to opening, to adopt free trade measures, but it also led to big technical innovations. It wasn't that the technology wasn't there. The main technology that is transformative then is the steam engine. The steam engine is old, from the early 18th century, but it's that you can use the steam engine to produce networks in railroads, transatlantic shipping. And this brings food to Europe from the rest of the world and really pushes the first era of globalization. So the second big supply shock that I think is at the origins of modern globalization is the energy price hikes of the 1970s, the oil crisis. And again, there are technologies, the container ship, that are already there, but aren't widely used. And the shock of the heightened energy prices means that there are incentives to break down obstacles to containerization. So in particular, ship workers, dock workers, trade unions resisted heavily. But in the 1970s, it's clear that you need to do something. And so containerization sweeps the world. Can we distinguish between supply shocks and demand shocks? Well, easily. It's a Economics 101 exercise in the sense that with the negative supply shocks, the prices are rising and the quantities that are produced, the quantities that are traded are falling, so prices and production move in different directions. The other way around for a positive supply shock. And demand shocks, like the Great Depression or like the global financial crisis, prices and production move in the same direction, downwards in the case of the negative demand shock. They have different responses. And it seems to me that this categorization is a helpful one in the sense that what we're living through at the moment is the fallout from a big negative supply shock that came with COVID. So we're living in a way in the aftermath of 2020 in the COVID epidemic. So what are the responses to that negative supply shock, to what COVID did? Suddenly people are aware of the way in which they're dependent on imports from somewhere. And in the immediate aftermath of COVID, because the ships are all in the wrong position, there were shortages of, in particular, of semiconductors. So there's a chip shortage that affects almost everything. But the result of it is that anybody who is sitting on some resource that is vital for other countries' production thinks that they can use the control of that resource in order to extract political advantages. So I think it's most obvious at first in the shape of energy policy. And here everybody will think of Russia and the way in which Russia controls its oil and gas supplies as a way of putting pressure on Europe. And the hope, the expectation was, we can't know it precisely, but historians, I imagine, in the future will be able to reconstruct this quite neatly, that the idea in February 2022 is that Europe is so dependent on Russian energy that it has to accept a quick move to seize the whole of Ukraine. But it's not just Russia. So I think if you just focus on one country, you miss the big picture, which is that everywhere countries are utilizing this. So another example, for instance, Spain imports natural gas from Algeria. Algeria is in a territorial conflict in the Western Sahara with Morocco. Algeria threatens to cut off the Spanish supplies of gas if Spain continues to send gas to Morocco. So the same kind of instrumentalization. China, I think it's clearer and clearer where the particular advantage of China lies. It's not that China is a preeminent source of consumer goods, which it is, but it's in particular the control of strategic raw materials, rare minerals, rare earths. And that becomes the key weapon with which the Chinese government responds in April this year to Donald Trump's tariff measures and to the so-called Liberation Day announcements. So what does the United States do for this? So one alternative is to think you need to build up semiconductors, and it's a very rational kind of policy. So that's the fundament of the approach of the Biden administration. But it's also a response, at least, to increase energy production and to increase conventional energy production, and that's the big message of Donald Trump. What does Europe do about this? That's more uncertain, and I think it's the topic of your discussion. But I want to come at the end of this, I won't speak for very long, but to some suggestions on this field. So let me just illustrate a little bit more the problems of this question of supply chains and supply chain dependence. The problem with supply crises, supply shocks, and demand shocks are very, very different. In demand shocks, it's clear that you just need more macroeconomic stimulus. You need more demand, more aggregate demand. In supply shocks, you don't need more aggregate demand. You need a particular product, and if you don't have that particular product, you make really big mistakes. So you can even have, it's not just a question of a shortage of semiconductors, it's the right kind of semiconductor. The logic chips, the high technology logic chips, the memory chips. It's not just a question of producing anything. So just as an illustration of this problem, in a couple of years ago, 2023, the EBRD produced a really nice report on this in its annual transition report, where it thinks about the Chinese resources that are crucial for the world's energy transition and for Europe's energy transition. After all, it's the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And so it has this big list of things that are all critical, but it doesn't really talk about many of them. It talks specifically about gallium and germanium. On that big table that I just showed, there's one reference to dysprosium. Dysprosium is a tiny bit on that table, but there's no reference in the text to dysprosium, and there's no discussion of how essential dysprosium is for the manufacture of semiconductors, how dysprosium is in everybody's pockets. It's in your iPhones. It's crucial also for the magnetic qualities for fusion technology, if you're thinking of new energy technologies. But in 2023, even a sophisticated scientific report doesn't think that dysprosium is central. But in 2025, it's one of the 7 rare earths that is then embargoed by China for the export to the United States. So, what have we got with the US tariffs? We've got a new supply shock for the United States because goods are becoming more expensive, and a demand shock for the rest of the world. So we're in a slightly more complicated position than the simple supply shock that you had after 2020. But let me just show you a couple of figures from the recent fund external stability report from July of this year. 2 really kind of fascinating graphics that juxtapose the centrality of China in the world trading network, in the way that it increases between 2001 and 2023, and the relative small size of the United States. So if you think about this and think about what it means for the trade war, is the trade war really likely to damage the world economy as a whole? Well, it's obviously doing some damage, but it's not big enough really to cause a world depression. And by the way, that's a very, very parallel argument to the one that many economic historians, I include myself in that, make about the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff at the beginning of the Great Depression. It was a serious blow, but it isn't enough to cause a world depression, and it didn't cause the world depression. So the United States has, last year the imports were about 3 trillion, so it's about 10% of the bit more than that, 12% of world trade. But not all of this is tariffed. So the tariffs are not on everything. For instance, the United States is not going to apply tariffs to many pharmaceuticals because most pharmaceuticals are imported. And if you apply tariffs to pharmaceuticals, you will simply make Americans pay more for their medication, make medication unavailable. So whereas the effective tariff is generally calculated at around 18%, if you look at the actual figures that were paid in the customs revenue in the last month that's available, it's less than that. So it's about the customs revenue with 10% of the imports in May of this year. So the trade effects are not really enough really to put a lot of pressure on many countries. And this is not going to destroy the world economy. And indeed, we see world trade continuing to expand, and there's going to be a continued dynamism of world trade. And we see new efforts, new multilateralism being constructed from the grassroots upwards. The initiative that Singapore and the UAE recently made for a trade and investment partnership is an example of this. So you compare this figure with the next figure that they put forward, which looks at the centrality of different countries in the world financial system. And you see there that China doesn't appear to be so central to the world financial system, but the United States is very, very central to the world financial system. And so this is the kind of story that could explode catastrophically. But if it explodes, the United States does more damage to itself. And this, indeed, in general, seems to be, at least in my impression, what the Trump measures are doing. I used to say that the United States is shooting itself in the foot with the tariffs. I wonder whether it's not more radical than that. It's shooting itself in the head, or maybe shooting itself in the heart when it's applying the tariffs to a range of poor sub-Saharan African countries. The story then is that I don't think the predatory superpower argument is right because of the capacity and the potential for self-destruction in the United States, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that later in the afternoon, in China. But this is like the story of the Old Testament story of the in the book of Daniel. You remember the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and how Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and all the wise people, the equivalent of the economists of that period, are going to interpret the dream, and nobody knows how to interpret this dream, because Nebuchadnezzar in the dream has seen a big statue, and the head of the statue is gold, and the upper part of the body is silver, and then there's iron, but the feet are made of clay. In German, it's auf Tönen und Füßen. So this is a vulnerable position, and the vulnerability is clear in the debate about whether the US dollar as a strong currency is an advantage to the United States, or whether it's a disadvantage that has cost the lives of American workers. And if you want to see the way in which that's worked out in a self-contradictory way. The famous paper of Stephen Miran from last year is the key piece of evidence for that. This is the vulnerability of the United States. China, you'll talk about it, but China has a long-run demographic vulnerability. So the world of predatory superpowers, those predatory superpowers, I think, will realize more and more that they stand on feet of clay. And you will see the dynamic of previous eras in which the negative supply shocks lead to an intensification of global networks, of global dependencies. And if China and the United States think that they can live outside that, they're living in a world of illusion. They're living in the world of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So the prediction, if I want to make a simple prediction out of the historical picture, is that there's actually a continuation of globalization, but in a new form, and very, very driven by technical developments. And the countries that will benefit most from that new globalization are the ones who are going to apply the technology in a dynamic and innovative way. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a lot of ground to cover because I was asked to talk about competitiveness and security from an EU perspective. And so I will cover it very lightly and quickly and superficially, and you will forgive me for it. And then we can have deeper discussions during the coffee break. So I will talk about both. Quickly, what I understand to be competitiveness, what I understand to be security. I have put economic in brackets because I think it cannot be separated from national security or hard security. I will say why. And the way I will address the competitiveness part is to take the Draghi agenda as the starting point, not because I think it is the perfect summary of what we need in Europe, but because it is the authoritative benchmark at this point. So I will take you through the agenda. I will tell you what the issues are. By issues, I mean mainly implementation, but also conceptual issues. Then we'll talk about security. Then I will try to relate the competitiveness and the security discussion to see what angles the security objective adds that are not already in the competitiveness agenda, and if there's a trade-off. And then I will put some agenda points on one slide that relate to economic security. Okay, so I define competitiveness the way most of you economists in this room would define it, as either productivity levels or productivity growth. I prefer productivity growth. And so two observations go along with that. The first is, I don't need to convince economists about this, but many do need to convince that equating competitiveness with market share generally does not make sense. Why? Because companies and countries are not the same thing. So if you want to draw a company analogy at the country level, then making profits, conquering market share is equivalent to accumulating external surpluses. So it's essentially mercantilism. And we know that mercantilism does not maximize welfare because you need trade, right? You need trade on the import side, on the export side. You need specialization. And so there's no zero-sum game between countries, but of course the philosophy of the new economic nationalism is to pretend that there is a zero-sum game. Now the problem is that if you read this in Krugman's brilliant 1994 essay, where he says that competitiveness is a dangerous obsession, he probably goes a little too far, because there are some sense in which competitiveness in the sense of market share in international markets and productivity growth probably overlap. So a high market share in international markets can reflect high productivity and innovation. So it can be a signal of competitiveness in my sense. And also some products could be predictive of future productivity growth. So this makes it complicated, and it means that one cannot completely dismiss the popular understanding of competitiveness. Now, what does Draghi do in his report? So he mostly comes down on the side of the economic definition, but he throws in some constraints. which sometimes make the whole thing a little bit problematic. So clearly one of his constraints in his report is that we stick to our emission reduction targets. So a lot of his industrial policy, for example, might be different if that was not a constraint. And there's also a sense that he does want to defend market share, particularly of the energy-intensive industry in Europe. Okay, so what is the Draghi agenda? So there are various ways of slicing the cake. This is one easy way of doing it. So he wants much better EU-level policy coordination. He wants a real push for the single market. He wants to deregulate or better regulate. He wants a massive investment push. So point 3 is the point that the report is most famous for, but the others are just as important. And you know, it's quite absurd, the degree to which he wants investment to rise, right? An overall rise of about 4.5% percentage points of GDP. And of that, he doesn't quite commit how much of it is public, but it would be by standard ratios about 1 to 2% of GDP. And then finally, he wants a green industrial policy. He's very strong on industrial policy, and he wants it in 2 ways: to promote clean tech, which goes along the lines of the Biden agenda. So one interpretation of the Draghi report is that it is, in effect, Bidenomics for Europe. And also he wants to subsidize the energy-intensive industry conditional on carbon abatement. And the argument is that this is necessary because these are hard-to-abate industries, so they cannot do without subsidies. Okay, so let me take you through the individual points. How are we doing on the single market push? So the Commission is trying on capital markets and electricity markets in particular. The jury is still out. And why is it still out? Because this agenda is largely under the control of member states. They are the ones that need to harmonize and agree to some degree of delegation. It has failed in the past for the obvious reasons, because it gives up national control, and of course there are national special interests that need to be overcome. So the question is, why would it work now? Simply because Draghi restates it. There are two possible answers. Maybe because of greater urgency. So that's the argument that Draghi himself makes, the sort of slow-boiling frog thing. So our productivity growth differentials are widening with respect to the US and, of course, China anyway. And maybe because there's a link to economic security. So he doesn't make that point a lot, but it could be one reason why we finally take this more seriously. But I'm afraid to report that the initial signs are not good. So there's the standard reluctance to reduce national control on electricity market unification, for example. On capital markets, there's a lot of resistance to supervisory integration, for example, which a colleague of mine, Nicolas Véran, has argued could be a key way of moving it forward. There are, of course, distributional implications. When you unify things, you're going to get winners and losers, and we don't really have a mechanism to compensate losers in the EU, in part because we do not have large centralized funds. And importantly, the costs of delay remain relatively low. So that's a really important conceptual argument. So you can say that Europe moves forwards in crises, but what does crisis mean? It may mean something like we're experiencing now on competitiveness. That's certainly the way Draghi is trying to sell his report. But just that because something is bad doesn't mean you'll get action. What you get action is something is bad, and the only way to get out of it is to do something in the next 3 months, right? This is why, for example, the SSM was created, right? There was a sense that delay would have been super costly in 2014. This is why we managed to get through the electricity crisis, through the energy price crisis in the fall of 22 reasonably well, because the winter was coming, right? And this type of deadline is not there when it comes to structural reform. There isn't a huge cost from doing capital markets union today or to doing it in 6 months. And so that is the fundamental difficulty. And the only way of solving this problem, I think, is leadership. Do we have the leadership? Not sure. Certainly in France, we have a whole, I think Ursula von der Leyen is actually trying to be a leader, but she has a hard time. I'm not sure about Germany. We will hear about that. Okay, how about deregulation? So this is partly happening in the sense that the Commission has embraced it, at least in its communication. The Commission is great at communicating, not so great at implementing, maybe. But if you look at what they are doing, it's a slightly schizophrenic response. So you have this barrage of so-called omnibus legislation, which are effectively an attempt to revise, modify, postpone, and lighten the burden associated with recently passed regulation. And so the most famous one is Omnibus 1, which is about reporting and disclosure requirements related to environment and emissions. And it's a bit of a disaster. Read that paper. It's basically a quick fix. You just let SMEs off the hook. You delay implementation on large companies. There's no attempt to actually review the underlying regulation. So I'm not convinced this is the way to go. If you look for deeper reviews, there is a reluctance to undertake them. So you talk to Commission officials, you say, oh, no, we will eventually do the real thing, but they have not committed to it. And on things like the AI Act or data protection, there is a real reluctance to move forward, which is analyzed in two nice papers. There is, by the way, a references section in the PowerPoint, which gives you the paper in case it's distributed. Okay, on the investment, it's just not happening. And on the private side, that's kind of obvious. So whatever might stimulate investment has not or not yet materialized, with the possible exception of high demand for defense products. And on the public side, we have the well-known fiscal constraints. And the reason why we can talk about this somewhat authoritatively is that we know what member states have put on the table in the form of their medium-term fiscal plans that they have submitted as part of the new fiscal framework of the EU. And if you do that, one thing that is quite striking is you have this high correlation between adjustment needs and the decline in public investment. So the type of correlation that we saw during the euro crisis, the countries that are fiscally under pressure, they start by cutting investment. You also see it in the new plans. In the aggregate, of course, you still get a positive number because you do have a bunch of countries that do have fiscal space, but it's a much smaller positive number, 0.25%, compared to 1 to 2%. And then we would want, and it's mostly driven by Germany, and probably Clemens will tell you half of this is fake. So we'll get to that. And then, of course, common borrowing for investment in the form of a new NGU, maybe a better designed one, is not really on the table, except possibly for defense. But even on the defense, where we suggested something in a paper in April, which in German I would call ordnungspolitisch sauber, was instinctively rejected. I can talk about that. So extreme reluctance to spend more. Green industrial policy. I mean, I'm shocked a bit because I'm increasingly an old-fashioned market conservative. This is what becomes of you as a center-left person if you just hang around for long enough. So this is happening or likely to happen, but there are two problems. The first is it's not happening the way Draghi wanted it. What he wanted was serious money for industrial policy at the central level, at the EU level, which is then allocated in a very clever way by a semi-independent process. But there's no such money. And so instead what the Commission is trying to do is some combination of quote-unquote liberalizing the state aid regime through the Clean Industrial Deal state aid framework, and then use a little bit of central money as incentives so the country will support largely the same objectives. But of course, they will still support just their own companies. So even if you coordinate on the objectives, you're not getting a level playing field, right? It is a problem for competition. And the conditions that are supposed to limit the distortion of competitions, the so-called negative conditions, are very weak, whereas the positive conditions, the conditions under which you can do this, are very, very broad, including famously electricity price relief for energy-intensive users. And then the second problem, and this is more conceptual and has less to do with the Commission, so this was in the Draghi report itself, this is one of the things I do not like about the report, is that not of all is actually good for competitiveness. So it's an abuse of the term. So it may be necessary for economic security, some of it, I'm not sure, but not for competitiveness. And the reason is that if you subsidize energy-intensive industry across the board, and to those of you who belong to the energy-intensive industry, I'm not opposed to any type of subsidy, but I think this approach is too blanket because it will subsidize even those energy-intensive production stages that probably should not be produced in Europe because they're much cheaper to import. So we import iron ore now. We probably should be importing some bundle of iron ore and electricity, namely direct reduced iron, because that's much cheaper as a way of importing electricity than building a complicated hydrogen pipeline. And so to the extent that then, this is a problem, I think, for the downstream stages of the energy-intensive industry that might be more competitive if we're a little bit more open to trade on this. But it's primarily a problem for everyone else because it keeps energy demand structurally high. And unfortunately, we live in a structurally energy-poor continent, not just in fossil fuels, but beyond that. Even after the energy transition, we don't have a lot of sun, and the wind is far from where we need it. And so it would make sense to import highly intensive intermediate products. So that is developed in a paper that we published a few months ago. Okay, now security. Again, I start with the definition. So it's about the ability to withstand adverse events. And so, as economists, we're sort of used to thinking about this because we want to mitigate, we want to prevent and mitigate crises, right? But we think as crisis as something that's either endogenous to the economic cycle or just an exogenous shock. The new twist here is that these crises can be about coercion, right? And so that introduces essentially a game theoretic element. It makes them endogenous to some extent. And so what you need to do with this, most importantly, you need resilience. Markus Brunnermeyer's stuff, so conditional on shock or coercion of a given magnitude, the damage is contained. But then I think you also need something else, which has to do with the fact that coercion is endogenous, which is, I call it autonomy. Right? I don't call it strategic autonomy because I don't want to sound too French, but I call it autonomy. And what that means is effectively a low degree of dependence that can be exploited by your adversary. And if you do that, then you are less exposed to shocks and coercion. So autonomy helps through two channels: directly by making shocks and coercion less harmful, but mainly because it makes coercion less likely to succeed. So clearly there is a relationship between how we behaved in Turnberry and our dependence on the US militarily, and in the case of Ukraine, right? And so this is why I'm saying it cannot be separated. Economic and defense security cannot be separated. Is there a trade-off between security and competitiveness? And so here, I think this is why this terminology, resilience versus autonomy is useful, because on the first dimension, the answer is no. On the second dimension, the answer is often yes. On resilience, I don't think there is a trade-off because when I'm talking about resilience, I'm mostly talking about the flexibility and size of the single market. And that's good for growth and resilience, even if the argument does not apply to all single market reforms to the same degree. So there's some single market reforms. So if you like, the ranking of single market reforms maybe gets modified by the security argument, right? The energy-related arguments would be even more important once you weight them with their security implications. But broadly, the case of all single market reforms is strengthened by security arguments. When it comes to autonomy, unfortunately, there is often a trade-off, right? And there's a trade-off through two channels. One, just through the government budget constraint, right? So we can choose to spend money on defense. We can choose on it to promote innovation. Maybe defense is good for innovation, but promoting innovation directly might be even better. So there is some trade-off there. But then, and this is what pains me as a free trader, there's particularly a trade-off through trade integration or specialization, right? So you can ameliorate the trade-off by not closing yourself and instead diversifying. But even diversification of trade involves losing some of the gains of trade, because the gains of trade are, by definition, about specialization. I'm almost done. Okay, so what does this lead to? This is my second to last slide. In a paper that I wrote with André Schapir and Jakob Kierkegaard for the last informal Ecofin in Copenhagen, we go through a list of autonomy increasing reform or investment that would not damage competitiveness, or at least not too much. So the most important one is defense. Reduce dependence on the United States through European strategic enablers, and importantly, and this message has not come through, create a European single market for the defense industry. That includes Ukraine, right? Otherwise, this whole rearmament stuff will be inefficient. Some companies will get immensely rich, and the taxpayer will lose, and we will be too slow. Technology, we could probably do something like European DARPA to close gap in critical dual-use technologies. We should, at very least, promote AI applications and adoption, including through regulatory reform, like I said before. On finance, I believe we need a more ambitious digital euro than the one we have right now, and this is something that might be combined with essentially promotion or tolerance of euro stable coins, making them safer by giving them access to ECB refinancing and then regulating and supervising them at the same time, effectively like narrow banks. And finally, trade is where the really difficult trade-off is. So we may need some managed trade in industrial policy to address the obvious choke points. This could justify subsidies and tariffs. The problem is that, and here I slightly disagree with Harold, he made it look very easy. These checkpoints are not so easy to identify, and there are essentially two problems. You don't know, and the second question was about that, your question, how easy one can substitute. Right? I mean, the experience of the Russian energy shock is that in the end, we were able to substitute out of the gas somewhat easier than we feared. But the other thing is you very often don't know what the economic damage is if you cannot substitute. So how much of it actually leads to a sharp recession, how much doesn't? And so we need to have that second dimension, which is maintaining and expanding market access to facilitate supplier and customer substitution. And that is a pro-trade message, not an anti-trade message. Conclusion, notwithstanding the Draghi report and some good initiatives, the agenda is not advancing fast enough, and that has to do with this lack of urgency that would motivate decisive collective action. Some elements of the so-called competitiveness agenda may actually be bad for competitiveness, primarily insufficiently targeted industrial subsidies. Economic security cannot be separated from national security. Deterring economic coercion requires reducing our dependence on US defense. The security agenda strengthens the case for accelerating single market reform, and we face difficult trade-offs on trade, and I'm not completely sure how to resolve them. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, and thanks for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. So again, this will be a bird-eye view on the economic situation of Germany. Of course, this will all be very superficial, but what I'd like to do is basically just present some facts which are, I believe, important to understand what's going on and move forward. So I'll say a few words about forecasts. Most of you will know these numbers, and I'll be very, very brief. And then some rather simple, but I believe important facts about the medium-term economic development in Germany that shed light on where we are. And then finally, about economic policy, what does the government do at the moment and what should it do? You probably know these numbers. So this is the most recent IFO forecast. So we've been stagnating for some time, in fact, shrinking after the last revision of the GDP data. We were surprised on the negative side because we learned that we've actually been shrinking for a couple of years. So 2025 is probably flat. And then in 2026, we expect growth because there is now all this debt financing coming, and it will hopefully lead to some growth. And the question is, of course, will this be sustainable, or will it just be a flash in the pan and disappear again quickly? Okay. More interesting, probably, the medium-term perspective. And so what I would like to do is kind of take a look at at some facts about German economic development over the last 10 years. You probably know this graph. So this is the development of GDP. Until 2019, Germany grew, in, let's say, regular fashion. And since then, we've been stagnating. And today, 6 years later, our GDP is at the same level as in 2019. This has never happened in the history of Germany after the Second World War. So 6 years of stagnation is quite bad. No, but what's worse is this. So what you see here is the development of private investment. It's not public investment, it's private investment. And private investment increased until 2019 and then has not been stagnating but falling significantly. So today, real investment is at the level of 2015. And because that's happening, we are constantly revising downwards the production potential of the German economy. Because people are not investing. So an important part of this story is actually residential investment. But even if we look at corporate, I won't go into the figures about corporate investment. Corporate investment has also been falling since 2019, but it's a little better. But the key component here is housing investment that's been falling. And then if you look at government consumption, the interesting thing is government consumption is growing and has been growing as if there was no crisis. So the government has just been gone on. So government consumption is basically employing people in the public service. So you would say, okay, in an economic crisis, actually, that's what you want. Maybe you want the government to spend more and employ more people, especially if you have high rates of unemployment. It's something we actually don't have. So what's going on here is that the public sector is competing with the private sector for people in a world where labor markets are actually relatively tight. But I think if you look at this graph, it's pretty obvious that this situation is unsustainable. We just cannot continue in this way with an rapidly expanding public sector and declining private investment. It's just not going to work. Now, it used to be the case that exports were leading the recovery. That used to be the normal German situation. We were used to that. So how has this developed? Here you see how exports have developed. Not great, but actually maybe not so bad. Given the circumstances, you could say, well, it could have been worse. But it's been moving basically with GDP and certainly not, lifting the German economy out of the recession. Imports have expanded very strongly. Of course, that was partly driven by energy prices, but not only energy prices. So imports have been rising, and as we'll see in a moment, behaving rather normally, I would say. But there is a clear weakness in exports, and of course, that's related to the decline in corporate investment. Of course, as we all know, to our key industries, the car industry, machinery, and so on. So that's reflected in this weakness in exports. I think it's interesting to compare this to economic development in earlier crises and over earlier crises. How did that work? So if you look at the time from 2002 to 2012, so, okay, we had this misery in the early 2000s, but then the economy recovered. And what you see here is that economic development in these previous crises was much more balanced. Yes, we had a decline in investment in the crisis, but then, it recovered again. And government consumption was a stabilizing factor. If you look at government consumption, by the way, it would be the same with private consumption. You don't see the financial crisis. It's just stable, and that's also true for private consumption. And that's in principle, that's a good thing, because it's a stabilizing factor in the economy. But there wasn't this disequilibrium occurring we have now. So we have a post-crisis, hopefully, situation which is fundamentally different from what we've had in previous years. And what we really need to address is the weakness in investment. And here is, the development in this previous decade of exports. And we had this classical pattern of exports lifting us out of difficulties each time. After the financial crisis, it was always this strength in exports, with exports expanding much more quickly and trade expanding much more quickly than GDP, and that's not happening now. So in a way, this is broken. Now it's interesting to very briefly look at some sectors. And here again, you see the blue line here this is now value added, which is different from GDP, and value added in different sectors. And what you see here is value added in manufacturing. So in fact, value added is a bit more stable than industrial production, and that's related to the fact that we see a structural change in our manufacturing sector. We are moving away from production, and we are moving more towards headquarter services, R&D, and these things. So we have been a bit more resilient in value added. than in production, but in recent quarters, this is also declining. So it's not going great, but it's a bit more resilient. And you see here what's really gone down is construction. So value added in construction, the red line here. In recent years, we've looked to southern European countries, and it's interesting to look at the case of Italy. Italy is the second largest manufacturing country, and it's interesting to look at them. So they've been growing a little better, but what's been going on there is in fact very similar to what's been going on in Germany. In a way, you could say no wonder, because Italian industry is very much integrated into German industry. There is the car, the automotive cluster, and you see, their value-added manufacturing is also flat. And what's really expanded in Italy is construction. Why? Because they have received all this money from Next Generation EU, from Europe, which was supposed to go into public investment. And they have basically diverted it to the super bonus. So they have used the money to renovate their houses. We are currently, I was last week, was very funny. I was in Italy and talked to a colleague, and we talked about the German investment fund. Next Generation EU was also an investment fund. And we were talking about the German investment fund, and I said, this is not going into investment, this investment money, it's going into consumption. And he said, well, you're like us, we did the same with Next Generation EU, and okay, it's a bit sad, but I'll come to that. Okay, so what will drive future economic growth or competitiveness? Many things, but in particular, of course, innovation and technology. So, this is a very complex issue, but I would just like to show you two statistics here. One is from a study I did with colleagues from Bocconi and Toulouse, and this was about R&D spending. So, R&D spending of the private sector. And the message of this report was that Europe finds itself in what we call a middle technology trap. So we are really investing all we have into slow-growing industries. Okay, especially, you could say Europe is a place where people do R&D for automotive. If you take that away, not much is left. And if you spend decades investing into a slow-growing industry, economic growth is slow. Okay, and the US, you see how the US is moving here. The US has invested, US companies have invested in fast-growing industries, especially digitization, and that's why their R&D spending has expanded very strongly and left us behind. So that's one observation, and the other is from a paper by Oliver Costa and a co-author. And I think that's an interesting debate. So this is about the reasons. Why is there so little innovation, especially in the tech fields? And they argue it's about restructuring costs. And the idea is if you want someone to invest in tech, it's a risky business. You have to be able to restructure very quickly, lay off people, if things go wrong, and things go wrong very often in very risky fields. And he has this, it's just a correlation they're showing. They are measuring restructuring costs, and they are saying, restructuring costs are very high in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and so on. And on the vertical axis, you have R&D spending in high-tech areas, and there is this negative correlation. Is there a causal link? This is no proof of that. But I think it's something we should really think about. Okay, this takes us to economic policy. First of all, what does the German government do? A lot of things. I will just focus on this infrastructure spending or public investment spending problem. Now, from the start, as I mentioned, if you set up a fund for infrastructure investment, the worry is always that the government says, yes, thank you, it's wonderful, we have this 500 billion, so we will take the items in our standard, in the core budget, our investment, we will put it into the new fund because the money is there, and with the freed funds, we will do something else. So that in the end, you use the debt to finance consumption. Okay, and so there was a lot of debate. You know, those of you who followed this will remember this in the German Bundestag. There was a lot of debate when you know, the rules were changed and so on, but it wasn't really solved. And what's going on now, at least in 2025, is quite bad. For instance, the Deutsche Bundesbank has a rather deep analysis saying that 30 billion, so the increase in debt in the Fund for Infrastructure is 30 billion euros in 2025, and the actual increase in investment is 2.5. So 93% of the funds are diverted, actually not going into investment. Now you can discuss these numbers, and of course, you know, if you try to calculate how much money is diverted, what you have to have is some counterfactual scenario, or, you know, how would infrastructure investment have developed in the absence of this debt fund? And you know, it's a standard problem. You have to come up with some idea, but the Bundesbank basically said, okay, I mean, if we incur so much debt for infrastructure investment, the least we should expect is that governments make an effort in the core budget as well, possibly increasing investment. And the Bundesbank just said, you know, we should at least have expected constant investment in the core budget. Now, that's not very, no, it's not too ambitious, but of course you can discuss these things. Clearly, the key issue is, you know, how do we make sure that additional debt really leads to additional infrastructure investment? So, you know, I'm not very optimistic that we will succeed in this. So maybe we will not get much more infrastructure investment. The Minister of Finance has already said that various highway renovations cannot take place because there's no money, which is very funny, given these 500 billion. It's hard to believe, but that's what's going on. So the money is diverted for consumption purposes or to plug holes in the budget. But we shouldn't forget, even if there was more infrastructure investment, things may temporarily get worse before they get better. At the same time, and I think that's something that should be discussed more, we need, you know, to the extent that we invest in infrastructure, we need to manage this in a way so that the burden is bearable. The best example of infrastructure interruptions is the A45, a highway between Dortmund and Frankfurt. I guess all of you have probably been affected by this issue. So there is this bridge that is under renovation, and it couldn't be renovated while maintaining the traffic. So they stopped traffic. And that's bad for everybody except for academics, because we now have a nice experiment. And we looked at the data, so we tried to estimate, it's ongoing work, but we tried to estimate the impact on the local economy. And here it is, so it's very preliminary still. But what we found is that the closure of this bridge has reduced employment by 2%, which is quite significant. So the cost of the shutdown is 50 million just for this area around Lüdenscheid. So I guess, you know, if that's true, the conclusion is we need to manage our renovation in a way that somehow maintains the flow of traffic. If we don't do that, you know, it's going to be very bad. But you know, let's talk about some positive things. So what should economic policy do? We all know, you know, there are these big issues like pension reforms, healthcare, old age. We need to do something about this. We need to reform the very sclerotic housing sector, but these are politically very contentious and complex issues. So I would like to talk about some more modest reforms that are maybe easier. Yeah, I think they are important, don't get me wrong, but maybe this is more important. So I just said innovation is key. So I don't understand why we do not have a chapter in the coalition agreement of the new government, which really focuses about new company creation and innovation. We don't have it. I mean, we have some keywords that have been dropped there, but it's just unbelievable that in this situation, we don't have a consistent agenda for more firm creation and innovation. It's actually relatively easy, but it's an agenda that affects the tax system, capital market regulations, labor, many things, you know, but we need this kind of agenda, and you know, this is not politically or ideologically disputed, right? It should be a no-brainer. You know, I'm a bit like Jeromin. You know, we have come up with these agendas, and I just don't understand why politicians don't implement them. This is a study about reducing red tape, and I won't go into the detail, but we have used real-world reforms here, not just some fantasy reform, real-world reforms, and estimated the impact on economic growth, and it's significant. So if we did the same in Germany, things other countries have done in the past, the result is GDP could increase by 4%, so in a range over 8 years. So if we did it, over 8 years, economic growth, the growth rate would be 0.5% roughly higher than without the reform. So it's really significant. So it's worth. Of course, this can be contentious because you have to get rid of certain types of government activity, but there is a lot of potential in there. GDP would be 4% higher permanently. So this is huge. Then labor supply. So there is this endless debate about our social transfer system, Bürgergeld and everything, and IFO has been working on this for a long time, and my colleague Andres Peichel has just come out with another paper suggesting a very fine-tuned reform of Bürgergeld. It's not cutting the Bürgergeld, but it's about, for instance, how much can you earn without losing any transfers. So you can earn a small amount in Germany without losing any transfers, and this is counterproductive to some extent because people use these very small jobs and then do not work more because the incentives are not right. Many combine this with black market work, and we show that by just calibrating this, we could increase employment by 150,000 full-time equivalents, and the government would benefit. So there would be an increase in the budget of 4.5 billion. Again, I don't understand why the government hasn't done it already. I really don't understand it.
Does the chart refer to what we have or what we want?
That's what we have. What we have is, this region here. It means, in this region, when you're here, you can work more, but you don't have more income. It's just not, there is no incentive to work in this, and it's not just the poorer people, but it extends into the middle class. There are no incentives. Even if you work significantly more, your net income doesn't increase, even above the Bürgergeld, and that's related to this Wohngeld, to the housing subsidies. And it's not easy to solve this problem if you don't want to cut transfers, but something you can do. And as I said, I think that's a no-brainer. The government should do it. Thank you.